You will get an opportunity to speak to the or to hear from the survivors. Sheila Jeske will come in and testify. She's going to talk to you about some of the injuries that she got. But briefly, you're going to hear about a collapsed lung, a dislocated hip, a fractured fibula, multiple surgeries to put her back together. And she's still suffering from the effects today and may have to undergo more. You will hear from Jennifer Johnson, the ride leader, how her femur and hip were broken in multiple places that needed surgery to repair. You will hear about neck fusion surgery for her due to the multiple injuries that she sustained. You will hear how she was wheelchair bound after that surgery, 7 to 8 weeks. You will hear from Paul Gobble. You will hear that he suffered a traumatic brain injury. He had a fractured vertebra and a fractured neck in his back area, and has, to this day, no real memory other than he left for a bike ride and doesn't know how he wound up in a hospital, in essence. You will hear from Paul Runnels, the last survivor. It was believed that he was the last person. He was up in the very front. He will tell you about his collapsed lung, his fractured pelvis, his fractured ribs, his fractured sacrum, broken collarbone, leg, shoulder, how he had to undergo a colostomy to repair some of the damage. And you'll see him, and he'll actually look to be in good health now here today due to modern medical science and rehab. You will hear from the first responders on scene of the chaotic mess that was going on when they first arrived, and how Mr. Pickett was in the general area of what was going on. And eventually first responders and the police had contact with Mr. Pickett, and you will hear how he appeared out of it, that he was looking but not responding, how his balance was unsteady, how he had to be assisted around because of his poor coordination and balance area. The officer that dealt with him primarily, who rode with him in the ambulance, will describe his observations of Mr. Pickett, his opinion that Mr. Pickett was in no condition to be operating a motor vehicle, that he was substantially impaired. You will hear how they drew a sample, or in this case, several samples of Mr. Pickett's blood, and that blood was sent off to a laboratory. And when the test results came back, multiple controlled substances were in his system. You will hear how there was active methamphetamine, how there was hydrocodone, which is also Vicodin, in his system. You will hear that there was cyclobenzaprine, which is also known as Flexerol, a muscle relaxer, in his system. And you will hear about, most importantly, because it was such an unusually high level, tramadol, painkiller.
Listen to the evidence. Listen to the instructions. I think one of the instructions the judge gave you preliminarily had to do with the second-degree murder that's charged against Mr. Pickett, 5 counts. There's certain things that have to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. First, those have to be shown. And then ultimately, the killing was not justified, excused, or done under circumstances that reduce it to a lesser crime. The judge has instructed you and will instruct you again on what reasonable doubt is. Often it's argued, well, reasonable doubt doesn't mean any kind of doubt, flimsy, but it's a high bar. The judge will give you some ground rules, but beyond a reasonable doubt means something. It protects citizens, and it means the prosecution, who has the burden, has to go beyond that reasonable doubt. Listen closely to all the elements. There are 14 counts in this matter. I put it to you that while on this June of 2016, June 7, there was a tragedy. There were 5 people killed. There were 4 other people that were, I think the evidence is going to show, severely injured. But that evidence isn't in yet. I think with Mr. Kanabe, it's going to be shown that a vehicle driven by Mr. Pickett did cause death and injury. But there's more elements than that. It isn't merely the causation. There's a state of mind that's required. There's some other elements that you have to look at. So the mere fact that Mr. Pickett did drive a vehicle, and that vehicle killed some people and seriously injured some other people, if that's shown, is not enough. Listen closely to the instructions. Listen to the evidence. And then you have to weigh, and you have to look at those scales of justice. And they're not even. They're tilted in favor of a defendant, whether it be one of you, me, somebody sitting in the gallery, or Mr. Pickett. And they have to shoulder that burden, put weight on the other side. Weight to satisfy the instructions given by the judge as to what second-degree murder is. Death caused by operating while under the influence. Serious bodily impairment caused by operating. Those are specific. It isn't he caused injuries, he's guilty. He did certain things that the prosecution has to prove. And I put it to you at the end of the trial, when you listen to the instructions, weigh the evidence, there will be insufficient evidence to convict Mr. Pickett of all the charges brought against him.
Thank you, Mr. Turple.